Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and I bid you all welcome to my essay video series on The Wolfman, the 2010 iteration. This film is a remake of the 1941 classic film of the same name, directed by George Wagner and starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the title monster. In the case of the remake, we see a film directed by Joe Johnston, who has been known for directing films such as Jumanji, Jurassic Park 3, and Captain America the First Avenger, while starring Benicio del Toro, Anthony Hopkins, Emily Blunt, and Hugo Weaving. Now, there are those of you who may be wondering why I'm doing an essay video series on this film as opposed to the original. Well, the reason for that is because the 2010 remake has been overlooked to such an unfortunate degree that I think it deserves so much more attention and appreciation. Not only did the film go through a rather troublesome production history, but it also ended up getting poor critical reception, performed terribly at the box office, and has even been swept under the rug by Universal themselves. If you ask me, this film, while not something which I would deem as great, turned out much better than a film that would actually warrant Universal deeming as one of the worst films they've ever made. In fact, I'll even go as far as to call The Wolfman 2010 a definitive Universal Monsters remake. While it's not quite the best Universal Monsters remake, objectively speaking, nor is it the best horror remake in general, it still stands out as a remake that stays true to the Universal Monsters classic which it is adapting from in terms of telling the same story and maintaining a gothic horror tone and atmosphere, while altering certain key details in the story in order to carve out its own identity. And so we come to this series, which is going to be in two parts. The first part, which is this one, we'll be discussing the film's story and character work as well as its thematic core, while the second will discuss the film's technical fidelity and werewolf-centric set pieces. We will be primarily discussing how the film holds up in terms of overall objective quality, with any subjective thoughts of mine being relegated to nothing more than secondary notations. And then, by the end of part 2, we will come to an overall conclusion on the film's quality. Now, regarding which version of the film we'll be talking about here, between the theatrical cut and the unrated cut, we're going to be primarily discussing the unrated cut, since it was pretty much the version of the film that Joe Johnston himself wanted to be shown in theaters in its final form before him and company were forced to make cuts, such as one may put it. This scenario isn't the same as what happened with Justice League, where, despite both versions of that film generally following the same story, the theatrical cut featured significant alterations as a result of rewrites and reshoots done by Joss Whedon, while the Snyder cut featured story threads, visual choices, extensive additions to certain character arcs, and whole scenes that Snyder himself intended to have in the finished product, to the point where both his cut and the theatrical version can be seen as two totally different films and/or experiences. In the case of the Wolfman 2010, however, both the theatrical and unrated versions are still the same film with the same director, cast, and crew at the end of the day. It's just that the unrated version is almost 15 minutes longer than the theatrical version and featured some extra scenes / extended versions of certain scenes that easily could have just been left in the finished product without the worry of it being too long to be shown in theaters. So, the long and short of it all is that, while we discuss this film from here on out, it's the unrated director's cut which is being discussed. So, now that we've done our introduction to this series, it's time for us to get our telescopes out and begin our examination of The Wolfman 2010. Here we go. So, a good place to start would be a brief synopsis before we go further into discussing the film's merits and/or flaws. The Wolfman 2010 generally follows the story of the original while bearing some very significant differences when it comes to the details. The story follows Lawrence Talbot, played by Benicio del Toro, an actor with a disturbed past who finds himself returning to his home in Blackmore after his brother Ben was brutally murdered by a mysterious creature. There, he meets back with his estranged father, Sir John Talbot, played by Anthony Hopkins, as well as his late brother's fiancée, Gwen, played by Emily Blunt, though his first meeting with the latter depends on which cut of the film we're talking about here, but then again, we're gonna be using the unrated director's cut as the subject of discussion, so in this case, Lawrence would be meeting Gwen again back in Blackmore after their introductions to each other back in America. However, on one night of a full moon, Lawrence finds himself attacked by the creature that killed Ben, which was none other than a werewolf, and as a result of being bitten by said beast, he goes on to be cursed to become a lycanthrope himself, eventually leading him to find out about his family's darkest secret. The Wolfman 2010 retains the original thematics regarding the internal struggle between man and beast, where Lawrence fights to retain his humanity against a curse that resides within him, which turns him into a monster that even serves as a physical embodiment of the darkness within him. However, while the original featured a Larry Talbot who becomes a werewolf that's a manifestation of his more sinful side, such as when he tries to make unwelcome advances on Gwen Conliffe, the remake depicts the wolf side of Lawrence as a manifestation of his dark past, leaving death, carnage, and torment in its wake, as well as the terrible legacy which his father, Sir John, had created, who has fully given in to the darkness within himself, and even tries to encourage his son into embracing their family's monstrous destiny. The remake's reimagining of the original's thematic core also gives it the freedom to go a step further by shaping its through line into being about one paying for the sins of past events beyond what one should be held accountable for. Lawrence Talbot had lived his life having to pay for the sins of his father, from losing his mother and being committed to Lambeth Asylum during his boyhood, to losing his brother and being forced to return home to find out what happened to him, only to be cursed with lycanthropy by his own father, who was the root of all of his pain. Even before he arrives in Blackmore, he is left with a cane with the head of a wolf on it cast in silver by an old man, which would go on to foreshadow certain events which are to come. Because of all the tragedy and death from the past which Lawrence tries to distance himself from, the Talbot name is deemed as cursed by the folks of Blackmore, and he finds himself being confronted by this reality, such as when he hears some men in a pub disrespecting his late mother due to her gypsy heritage. During his stay at Talbot Hall, as funerary preparations for Ben are being made, Lawrence is once again haunted by memories of the past, which revealed that he saw his mother dead with a slashed throat and a razor in her hand. Or at least that is what he's been initially conditioned to perceive had happened since his time in Lambeth. And all this is prior to when he's even attacked by his werewolf dad, which makes things even worse in terms of Lawrence's reputation. Such as when a group of townspeople, including a reverend and even the town doctor, approach Talbot Hall to arrest Lawrence without a warrant. Things then culminate to a breaking point when he is discovered covered in blood after his first night as a werewolf, and when he's committed back to the same asylum where, after weeks of torture, he learns of his father being, as Ernst Stavro Blofeld would put it in the 2015 film Spectre, the author of all his pain. Despite all of his helpless efforts to try and resisting the change, it's all for naught as he loses control and becomes a beast once again during a presentation at the asylum, as well as him escaping, but not before killing a whole bunch of people, including the head doctor, striking terror and causing carnage beyond his control in the streets of London, which leaves him with no alternative but to go on the run and to confront his father. However, even when he finally avenges his mother and brother by ridding himself of Sir John, his own father, the man who was responsible for his anguish and suffering, Lawrence is still a werewolf and is yet to be rid of his curse, for being rid of it will cost him his life. And so, he is eventually rid of it for good by Gwen Conliffe. Once he is, as Maliva would put it, set free, it's not just that he is freed from his lycanthropy, but he is also freed from the pain and torment which he had been forced to live all his life. However, even with the death of Lawrence and the end of the Talbot bloodline, the terrible curse started by Sir John Talbot still lives on, as we see Inspector Aberline now bearing the mark of the beast, just as his attacker Lawrence did a few minutes prior. Another one of Maliva's quotes in the film, which is later reiterated during its final moments by Gwen regarding the question of where the beast begins and the man ends, or vice versa when considering the prospect of them being set free, and whether or not it's a sin to do so, rings true when taking the Talbot family's tragic tale into consideration. Lawrence is shown to be a man who struggles with becoming a beast, while his father, after years of having embraced his curse which had killed his own wife, has devolved into being a beast, both inside and out, that resembles a man when a full moon isn't present. The question then culminates towards an answer when both father and son are slain. While murder on its own is considered a sin, the context of Sir John's murder by Lawrence was that, despite it being outside of Lawrence's control since he was a Wolfman at the time, it was a form of justice not just for the murders of Solana, Talbot, and Ben, but also many other people who were slain by Sir John up to this point. Lawrence's death at the hands of Gwen was both done as self-defense on her part and done by her to save him from a fate worse than death. A fate where he would be forced to live with so much innocent blood on his hands, some of which even potentially being of those he loved. And so the answer of whether or not it would be a sin to kill a werewolf who is both a beast and a man is complex, since in this case the sin being committed would be necessary in order to stop any further suffering which the curse of lycanthropy would inflict, with said suffering being inflicted on not just the people who may be on the receiving end of a werewolf attack, but also the werewolf himself. In conclusion, The Wolfman 2010 bears a thematic core that takes a familiar through line from its original counterpart and adds an extra, darker layer to the story, which serves to further bolster that thematic core while still allowing the film itself to have its own identity and stand on its own as a worthy update to the classic. Which brings us to our next segment, the characters. Not only does the film boast a pretty solid thematic core and storyline, but there's also some strong character work going on as well. First and foremost, the Wolfman himself, Lawrence Talbot. Regarding Mr. Talbot here, I kinda went over a good chunk of what makes him such a solid, compelling protagonist back in the theme portion of this video already, but there is still a little more to say about him before we discuss the other characters, so I may as well just go ahead and speak my piece here. Lawrence is shown to be a good man trying to move away from his traumatic past, only for the demons which have spawned from it to return with a vengeance once he is called home in the wake of his brother's murder. Even his initial coldness towards Gwen at the very beginning of the film, again if we go by the unrated cut, doesn't stem from him being an inherently bad person, but rather it stems from his need to steer clear from his familial tragedy in order to live a better life. When he becomes the Wolfman, it's a physical manifestation of the darkness within him coming to light, much like in the original film. However, the key difference here lies in the kind of dark traits that each iteration of Talbot's wolf form represents when his transformation is complete. In regards to Lon Chaney Jr.'s take in the 1941 film, Larry Talbot was a man with a great deal of charisma, but he didn't know when not to overstep boundaries in his pursuit of women, such as Gwen Conliffe, which his charisma was meant to overshadow. However, once he becomes a werewolf, that charisma is stripped away, and all that remains is a creature with no sense of boundaries whatsoever, to where even those negative traits of Larry's have been twisted into something far worse than before, especially when, towards the end of the story, we see him nearly killing Gwen, his own love interest. Meanwhile, Benicio del Toro's version in the 2010 remake is a tortured soul with a lot of psychological baggage that manifests into a monstrous form and becomes an extension of Sir John's evil, which has haunted Blackmore and the Talbot name for years, killing many people as well as endangering his brother's own widow, Gwen, who just so happens to be caught in the middle of the ordeal. In both the original film and its remake, Lawrence's death is seen as tragic as his life was met with a turbulent end in order for others to be saved, as well as for the man himself to be saved from his own curse. As Maliva would put it, though I'll be paraphrasing her in this case, the road he walked was thorny, but he would never have to walk it anymore, for his soul was free. Thus he could finally know peace. More fitting words couldn't have been spoken in regards to Lawrence Talbot in the 2010 film. And considering that this film was a project which he really wanted to do because of his passion for the source material and Lon Chaney's work in it, Benicio del Toro serves as an excellent and fitting choice to play a more brooding take on Lawrence Talbot, as presented in this film, capable of presenting a man with a lot of pain in his soul without letting his character's emotional state being overstated. So in short, we have a very well characterized and nuanced take on a classic character in the form of Lawrence Talbot as he is portrayed in this remake, where a great deal of respect and appreciation for the original version is paid without shamelessly copying or undercutting itself, thus becoming a compelling protagonist in his own right. Next up, we have Lawrence's father, Sir John Talbot, who serves as an effective antagonist for the film. Whereas the 1941 iteration of John Talbot, as he was portrayed by Claude Rains, was a man of reason who, until he sees it for himself by the end, doesn't believe that a man could literally change into a wolf under a full moon, and that lycanthropy is just a state of mind. The 2010 iteration, well, to put it simply, is off his rocker and had gone past the point of no return in regards to his sanity a long time ago. He's a man whose soul has been blackened by his curse to the point where he has fully accepted it and even takes a sort of twisted pleasure from it, and he wishes for Lawrence to go down this same path. Whereas Lawrence fights, despite it being for naught, to contain the beast within himself, so John is reconciled with his monstrous side to where they are both one and the same in terms of personality, hence the latter undergoing a significantly less painful transformation as he welcomes it like an old friend. Not to mention, we are given a rock-solid performance by Sir Anthony Hopkins where he just does a fantastic job at conveying his character's creepy, shadowy, and even devilish demeanor, maintaining a tone of mystery and dread in every scene he's in. The only thing that's kinda off or even unnecessary about this character was a subtle hint through dialogue of Sir John feeling a bit of a creepy lust for Gwen, hence his reference to when he had an altercation with Ben. This first and last reference to it was when Sir John visits Lawrence at Lambeth, and it's never mentioned again, nor is it really elaborated on all that much at any point prior. Perhaps this was a remnant of an idea from a previous iteration of this film's script, but as it is, this particular detail doesn't really add much to Sir John's character since he's already been established to have fallen far enough from grace to admit to killing his own wife, the mother of his children, yet still wishing for Lawrence to be an heir to his kingdom. In fact, you could have cut this detail out and nothing would really change from his character. Aside from that bit though, Sir John Talbot is an effectively creepy and sinister villain who adds to this film's story in a way that makes it unique to what came before while still being well executed. Next, we have our third character, whom we shall discuss here, who is none other than Gwen Conliffe, played by Emily Blunt. While certain elements from the original are retained and are called back to, such as her becoming a love interest for Lawrence over time, as well as her owning an antique store, Gwen is still very much reimagined as the widowed wife of Lawrence's brother, Ben, who then develops a bond and even a romantic connection with the former despite the unfortunate circumstances. She goes on to serve as the one single light that shines in Lawrence's darkest hour, like a candle left lit in a room shrouded in shadowy despair, giving Lawrence some much needed warmth to escape the cold harshness of everything else going on in his life, hence why he is so protective of her to the point of begging her to leave Talbot Hall when it's all the more clear to him that his supposed curse is in fact real. Between her and her 1941 counterpart, the 2010 iteration of Gwen is easily the more prominent of the two. Not that the original version, played by Evelyn Ankers, is bad, considering that she did serve the original film's storyline rather well, but the more personal connection between Lawrence and Gwen in the remake, two people who are drawn together by tragedy, allows for the latter to play a much meatier role in terms of maintaining the film's emotional stakes, where she finds herself in the difficult position to potentially be the one who has to pull the trigger on Lawrence, which in turn adds to the tragic end of Lawrence's life by Gwen herself as a means to save the man whom she loved and to give him peace. While not her best performance, especially given her repertoire, Emily Blunt still puts in the work and does a great job of portraying this character, especially when she has to put on the waterworks, whether if she's in mourning for her fiancé's death, or if she finds herself with no alternative but to put down a man whom she loved, who, by this point, has become a beast. So with that said, 2010 Gwen, much like Lawrence, is a well-realized reinterpretation of the 1941 version of the same name that services the story very well, especially when it comes to enhancing the drama within the text of it all. Lastly, we have Inspector Francis Aberline, played by Hugo Weaving, a man who plays by the book while being steadfast and determined to solve any deadly case which comes his way. Aberline was once involved with the case of Jack the Ripper, whom he was unsuccessful in capturing, hence Lawrence's remark about his reputation being rather strained due to such a failure. Nonetheless, he is called in to investigate the recent string of vicious murders in Blackmore, as well as to question Lawrence, who was not only on the scene of one of said killing sprees, which he was shown to have survived, but also has a history of being diagnosed with mental illness, which gives the inspector reason to consider the prodigal son a suspect. However, unlike the people of Blackmore who call for the Talbots to be arrested simply for being cursed to the point of committing a form of vigilantism by trying to arrest Lawrence without a proper warrant, as I mentioned earlier, Aberline doesn't consider the curse angle to be solid grounds for getting a warrant for Lawrence's arrest, stating that such red tape is key to maintaining law and order, and understandably so due to the fantastic nature of lycanthropy. However, Inspector Aberline eventually bears witness to Lawrence's condition and becomes fully committed to hunting him down, only to be attacked by Wolfman Lawrence, whom he was even willing to sacrifice himself to in order for Gwen to escape. However, this noble deed wouldn't come without a cost, because as a result, Aberline would from then on be doomed to become a werewolf himself on the next full moon. While Inspector Aberline isn't the deepest character by any means, he works well as a foil for Lawrence as an authority figure that represents a force for the latter to evade, an obstacle for Lawrence to overcome in his quest to avenge his family, only to become a vessel for the continuation of the Talbot family's dark and tragic legacy, when he too is afflicted with the very same curse which he was tasked to quell. And of course, Hugo Weaving does a good job playing this character with a strong presence of authority and unwavering persistence. So the character work in The Wolfman 2010 remains pretty strong overall, and in certain cases helps in bolstering the film's story and thematic through line, with said character work for certain individuals actually working on their own right to where they could even be considered as equal to the original, if not better. And so that pretty much is going to have to do for part 1 of my essay video series on The Wolfman 2010. Stay tuned for part 2 where we will discuss the film's technical fidelity and then we will come to a conclusion on the overall quality of the film as a whole. But until that second part comes, I would like to thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later.